Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're not just looking at a major historical figure, we're actually looking at the words we use to describe him.
Exactly. And our case study for this is Ahmed Cevdet Paşa, a giant of the 19th century Ottoman Empire. He was a statesman, a jurist, a historian during the Tanzimat reform era.
I mean, his fingerprints are everywhere. He was central to codifying civil law in the Moselle. He ran huge educational reforms, wrote these absolutely monumental histories.
And that's the thing. He's so important, but the real question for us isn't what he did, but how we package it. When historians look at someone like Cevdet Pasha, they often grab for this one very powerful, very convenient term, the bridge personality.
Right. It suggests he's this perfect link, connecting a so-called traditional past to a modern future.
It sounds like a good thing, doesn't it?
It sounds like a compliment. He's the guy who made it all happen smoothly. But the whole point of this deep dive is to show you how that one little metaphor, that simple label, can actually distort our view of him completely.
We're going to dig into how calling someone a bridge can lead you straight into these classic historiographical traps. Things like teleology, anachronism.
And instrumentalization. And why does this matter? Because the words we choose decide everything. They decide if we see Ahmet Cevdet Paşa as a world unto himself, a thinker, solving his problems in his time.
Or if we just see him as a function, a simple step on a graph that we drew, a graph leading right to us. We have to decide if he was a subject in his own story or just an object in ours.
So let's start with that traditional reading, the one that really leans into the bridge idea. It's a very positive, very modernist way of framing him.
Oh, absolutely. In this view, Cevdet Pasha is the perfect transitional figure. He's the one who bridges the old style of history writing, the Vakanuvaslik, the official court chronicles, with modern historiography.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense. An official chronicler had a very clear job, right? Record events, legitimize the dynasty. How does Cevdet Pasha start to move away from that, but still keep one foot in that world?
Well, he still uses the language and the forms of authority from that classical
That
tradition. He had to. That's what gave his work legitimacy with the more conservative parts of the state.
But at the same time.
At the same time, he's weaving in principles that we now see as distinctly modern.
Like what, for example? What are the big changes?
The biggest change is that his work reflects the needs of the new Tanzimat bureaucracy. It's a centralizing, rationalizing state. So you see this focus on the orderly classification of events, a much more critical and, selective use of sources.
And the purpose of history itself changes.
Profoundly. For Pasha, history wasn't just about celebrating the Sultan anymore. It was about creating a library of case studies, of lessons for rational state reform. It becomes a kind of bureaucratic manual, not just a royal story.
So the traditional conclusion, the bridge conclusion, is that he's this necessary middle step. He's the intermediate link that lets the Ottoman Empire move smoothly toward a modern, rational, maybe even secular way of doing history.
Exactly. He's valuable because he makes the future possible. He's the precursor.
Okay, now let's flip that on his head and look at the critique. This alternative reading is really skeptical of that whole idea of a smooth line. When we call Cevdet Pasha a bridge, we're basically judging his whole life based on an outcome that hadn't happened yet.
That is the core of it. That's the danger of teleology. You're shaping the story of someone in the past based entirely on the ending that you already know.
So if we decide that modern history was the goal all along,
Then Pasha's only value is in how he helped get us there.
and that means we start to ignore or even downplay the parts of his work that don't fit that neat progress story. We cheer for his orderly files, but we kind of brush past his deep engagement with Islamic law in the Moselle or his focus on classical ideas of moral order.
Right. The critical view says we should just throw out that linear path altogether. Instead of seeing his work as halfway to something, as incomplete, we should see it as a complete, coherent expression of the late Ottoman intellectual world.
A world where multiple logics were happening at once.
Yes, his writing blends all of them. Classical ideas of legitimacy, the new needs of bureaucratic record-keeping, and the political reform programs of his day. They all exist at the same time.
So he's not a step towards something new. He's the product of all these systems interacting in that moment. He stops being a precursor, and he becomes an intellectual bureaucrat trying to solve the massive problems of his own time, not ours.
Precisely. We can still see the hybridity, the blending, but we stop calling it transitional. For him, it was a stable, complete system of knowledge.
This gets us right to the theoretical core of this whole problem. Let's talk about the danger of anachronism. How does the bridge metaphor set a trap for historians here?
Anachronism is when you load up a past actor with goals or ideas that only came about much later. And the bridge idea isn't automatically anachronistic, but boy, does it make it easy to fall into that trap.
How so?
Well, if we just say his work looks hybrid because it has some early modern bureaucratic elements, that's fine. That's just a description. But if we claim that Pasha intended to pave the way for, say, modern Republican history, that's anachronism.
Because the very idea of Republican history didn't exist in his world. He couldn't be aiming for a target he couldn't see.
Exactly right. The bridge always rests on this assumed line. Tradition goes to modernity. The anachronism happens when we use our knowledge of the future to guess his intentions. We're basically telling him, you didn't know it, but you were actually one of us, a modernist.
That feels incredibly arrogant from a historical standpoint.
It is, because it dismisses the logic of his own world. We forget that he was innovating within an Ottoman context for Ottoman problems, not just trying to catch up to some European model.
Which leads right into the next problem. Instrumentalization. When you call someone a bridge, you're not really talking about them anymore.
You're not. They stop being a world in themselves. They become a means to an end, a transition object. I mean, think about a real bridge. Its only purpose is to get you from one place to another. It has no value on its own.
And when we do that to Cevdet Pasha, his work is only valued for getting us to the next stop on the line. Modernity, the nation-state, secularism, whatever it is.
Exactly. So instead of a brilliant mind grappling with the potential collapse of an empire, he's just a data point on a graph of progress.
And this creates a really damaging hierarchy of value.
A huge one. Tradition gets labeled as old, backward, failing. Modern is new, correct, successful. And the bridge, well, it's stuck in the middle. It's incomplete, it's halfway, it's not quite there yet. The metaphor assigns him a secondary status from the very beginning.
You know, this whole thing sounds very familiar. It sounds a lot like what we criticize in much older ways of writing history.
It's the ghost of Whig history, absolutely. It's that old idea of reading the entire past as this glorious, inevitable march that leads right up to the present day.
So when we say Cevdet Pasha opened the way for modern history, we're buying into that Whig idea.
We are. We're assuming modern history is some neutral, final, superior goal that everyone, everywhere should have been aiming for. And the whole point of this critique is to ask whether modern should be our default, unquestioned destination at all.
So if these older frameworks are so full of traps, what do we do instead? What does contemporary historiography offer as a solution? It seems like the big shift is from talking about the gaps between periods.
Space the bridge is supposed to fill.
Exactly. And instead focusing on the complexity of the period itself.
That's the pivot. And one of the best tools for that comes from what's known as conceptual history, or Begriffsgeschichte. The key insight here is that our big mistake is applying our modern categories like modern versus traditional back onto the actor. We just assume they meant the same thing then as they do now.
But the meanings of words change over time.
Drastically. So conceptual history says the question isn't, was Cevdet Pasha modern or traditional? That's our question. The question we should be asking is what his concepts meant. What did nizam, order, asla, reform, devlet state, and tari history actually mean in his world at that exact moment?
By focusing on his vocabulary, we anchor him in his own reality.
And we avoid forcing him into our 21st century boxes.
And another really powerful alternative here is the idea of multiple modernities.
Right. This school of thought completely rejects the idea that there's just one single European model of modernity that every other society is just trying to catch up to.
And if you get rid of that single finish line,
then Cevdet Pasha is no longer a bridge to something else. He's an architect of something in its own right. He's one of the people defining what Ottoman modernity actually was. The legal codes, the bureaucracy, that was a unique local modernity, not just a transition to someone else's.
we can also zoom in even further, right, with things like microhistory or practice history. These approaches almost make the whole timeline irrelevant.
They do, because they shift the focus from the big narrative to the small everyday actions. Instead of trying to place him on a timeline, we just look at what he was literally doing. His techniques for organizing documents, his method for cross-referencing sources, the actual physical process of writing the Tarihi Cevdet.
And when you focus on that practice, on the act of writing in a bureaucracy, what does that show you?
It just shows you the hybridity naturally without needing a big metaphor. You see a bureaucrat using classical language because that's what was effective and legitimate. The need for a bridge just sort of evaporates because you see his actions as practical problem solving, not as some grand ideological project for the future.
So here's the really provocative question. If all these historians know about the dangers, why does the bridge metaphor stick around? This is where something like narrative theory from Hayden White comes in.
And it really forces us to look at ourselves as historians. Narrative theory asks, is the bridge a real thing we found in the past, or is it just our own rhetorical trick?
A storytelling device.
A storytelling device, an emplotment. It's something we use to take a reality that was messy, complex, and maybe even contradictory, and we force it into a simple, linear story that's easy for a reader to follow.
So the historian uses the bridge not because it's true, but because it's useful. It solves a narrative problem for us.
It makes a messy history feel manageable. It gives direction to what might otherwise look like chaos. And once you realize the term is serving your own storytelling convenience more than the historical reality, you see the problem.
Okay, so if bridge personality is out because it's just too loaded with risk, what do we use instead? What's the better, more precise language for talking about someone like Ahmed Cevdet Paşa?
We need language that's descriptive and analytical, but that doesn't pass judgment on the outcome. It has to acknowledge the blending of ideas without creating a hierarchy.
Can you give us a few concrete examples? What's a better way to say it?
Sure. Instead of a bridge, you could say he embodies a multi-layered epistemic position. You could call his work an intersection point of classical historical narrative and modern bureaucratic recording logic. Or, something simpler like a hybrid writing practice defined by the late Ottoman knowledge regime.
What those phrases do is they place him in his time dealing with simultaneous pressures instead of putting him between two times.
That is the key. You're observing the interaction, the fact that new procedures had to work with old claims to legitimacy, but you refuse to label one side as dying and the other as rising.
All right, let's pull this all together. The bridge personality narrative is tempting. It's easy, but it is almost always tied to a teleological, progress-obsessed way of thinking that distorts the past.
It forces fascinating people like Ahmed Cevdet Paşa into the boring role of just being a step toward an inevitable future.
So our conclusion from this deep dive is that we have to treat historical figures not as means to an end, but as dynamic, complex, often contradictory thinkers who lived right in the messy middle of their own moment.
Their world was the destination. It wasn't just the road to get to our world.
And this problem, it's not just about 19th century Ottomans. You see this everywhere. I mean, think about your own field, whether it's art, science, philosophy. Who are the figures who are only ever defined by where they led us instead of where they actually were?
And that really raises the final question for all of us. If defining the past only in terms of our present is such a trap, what hidden assumptions about progress are we subscribing to right now? It's a powerful reminder to make sure our vocabulary as historians doesn't end up silencing the reality of the people we're trying to understand.